All right, let me just get on present here. Sorry, I was having computer issues. Hopefully everything's fine now. Okay, can everyone, is it sharing? Can you see my presentation?
Yep, we're set.
Okay, thanks. Okay, the project that I did with Stephanie started, we were working on how to build a water harvesting basin at Borton on our campus. It did not start with that. It started remote with just a study of water, the fourth grade study of water. We did not know at the time what it was going to build to, but this is what it eventually built to. And I am really, really excited with the way that it's turning out. So our initial question when we were still remote was, where does our water come from? And that's what I started studying with my students. We looked at where our water, the water that we actually use in our homes and at school and in Tucson, where we get it. And we tied in our social studies standards by looking at the history of irrigation in Arizona from the Hohokam people. We looked at current issues in Arizona. We read some articles and videos and about how the Thanawatham how the border wall is affecting them and their waterways and their ability to interact with water the way that they need to for their families, their homes, their businesses, their livestock, their plants. Planned communities around Phoenix, how new planned communities put a real strain on our available water in Arizona. And then, of course, the usuals of the water cycle, looking at how water gets into the ground, infiltration, wells, things like that. So we did all that remotely. This is just a screenshot of how I started planning this project before I knew exactly what it was going to be, but the backwards planning of thinking about what I wanted students to learn. At the end, I just wanted, whatever we ended up doing, I wanted to make sure that they were able to make evidence-based judgments and choices about water use and conservation. So I think that's it's a really big deal everywhere, but especially in Arizona when we have different entities fighting for use of our water, from growing cotton to planned communities to water rights in Phoenix, people that can water their lawns because they have first water rights and things like that. So I was thinking long term, what do I want students to eventually be able to make choices about, like as citizens and as voters? So I wanted to make sure that they understood enough about water to be able to make evidence-based judgments in the future. The main understandings that I stuck to for them to understand that water is a finite resource, access to water is not equitable, not everyone has the same access, and that not all uses of water are equal. Sorry, I want to go back to this one. Okay, sorry about that. So some student pictures, some screenshots of work. When we were remote, we worked on our own first, and then with Project WET, they helped us as well to build groundwater models. So we got materials to all the students so that everyone could build groundwater models. We used a science notebook kind of approach to take notes, make predictions, and think about where water was going with different soil types and with pumps. We also learned a lot about freshwater, again, through videos and readings and discussions, so the students could start to think about the fact that we were losing our freshwater resources, what sorts of impact that had. So these are all student work examples. As they watched and read, they just take notes on nouns and verbs and adjectives that they're thinking about, so that they can then produce sort of summaries or bring their ideas together. This is kind of an equalizing activity so that all of my students, regardless of like ability levels, can participate and think deeply about what they're learning and reading. We looked at tap water versus bottled water, the use of bottled water versus tap water, and then students made some posters trying to convince people to use tap water instead of bottled water. By the time we did this, we were back in person and we were using our tap water. Some students bring bottled water from home, but I have a big, huge insulated container that they know is just tap water. We fill it up in our sink, we pour it in there so that they can access it easily all day. So they just started to get them thinking about, water use, water conservation, where we get our water, all that. Again, they learned that most of the bottled water comes from the same sources where we're getting our tap water, and sometimes the sources aren't even as good as our tap water sources. So just some more connections we made looking at water as a whole. These are some student responses after we did an investigation about how rivers and change are related. We had an ongoing theme of change this year, like everyone did, obviously, because we were experiencing so much change. So we kept bringing up the idea of change in all of our studies. Like in math, we would talk about change. How are these numbers changing in our place value system? How are fractions changing? I kept using that term. We brought it up in everything we did, our social studies, our language arts. When we would revise, we would talk about changing. So I also tied it in with our water study as we learned about rivers. And these are some student responses after learning about rivers to think about how rivers and change are related. Just another way, again, to differentiate the learning and help some of my differently abled students think deeply about topics and make connections between their learning. One of the big things we did while we were still remote was water cycle narratives. After the students had learned a ton about the water cycle, they created narrative stories following a water molecule through the water cycle. These are just some screenshots from their presentations. They made presentations and then they presented them to their parents and school members in an online format in a Zoom. So that was really fun. There was a lot of, they had to plan them first. And Stephanie and I helped to make sure that what they were saying actually made sense and was part of the water cycle. They got peer editing feedback from each other, revised them, and then finally presented them to parents and staff. So once we returned to Borton, that's when Stephanie started talking about what else can we actually do with this water study. So we shifted our focus to how water is actually used, and we specifically focused on Borton. We did a lot of brainstorming, how they thought water was used at Borton, and then we were able to go out and survey and walk around and look at where we saw water at Borton, where we didn't see water, what was happening to it. While they were walking around doing their surveys, they found that Stephanie had put up a new outdoor hand washing station. We have one at Borton already. The students use after they do recess first and then they go to lunch. So they go to the hand washing station, they can all wash their hands and then they go into lunch. It's these big metal tubs here. Well, they found that Stephanie had put up a new one to deal with the fact that there were so much more hand washing in the time of COVID. They started looking at it and realizing that it was not piped anywhere. The original hand washing station is piped and waters some plants. It goes through a little, what we call the Borton River, and waters some plants. And this one wasn't piped anywhere. So Stephanie was talking about showing them the hose and where was the water going, and we needed it to go somewhere. So this kind of introduced the problem, the main project that the students then moved on to solve. So the students realized that the water coming from the tub needed to go somewhere. It was really close to a portable. It couldn't just pool next to the portable. They knew that that could do damage. Stephanie talked about, she said one suggestion was to just pipe it into the sewer system. And the students right away were like, well, why can't we use it like we use the water from the other one? So they went and investigated our other hand wash station. They followed it, they watched where the water went. And they identified that as a model. We were talking about models. Our BEL, our outdoor learning, our environmental learning lab that Tia talked about, we'd already been out there a lot and talked about how that was a model for our whole desert ecosystem, how sometimes we use a smaller version of something so that we can watch and analyze and make observations about scientific processes. So they said, let's go look, let's go look at the other one. Let's use it as a model to figure out what we can do. And so from there, the project just started to build. They realized they wanted to use the water. So we needed some resources. We had our model, We started reading, watching videos. We used a lot of the watershed management videos and materials to look at rainwater harvesting, how and why you would do that. And they started planning, lots of sketches, lots of observations, back and forth, thinking about how to use the gray water from the hand washing station and what we could realistically do with our confines of space, because it was already located in a location. And they had some pretty big ideas. At first, they wanted to do things like going under sidewalks and around and across the playground. So it took a while. Stephanie and I really wanted them to figure out which of those ideas were feasible and which ones were not. So we gave a lot of time and discussion to that. They brainstormed questions that they needed to answer in order to, that they had and that they needed to answer in order to do this project. After they had brainstormed their questions, we went through and asked them to think about which ones we could, and Steph, you can jump in if you want, which ones we could answer by observing. Those are the ones with the little magnifying glass. Observing was a big part of our science this year. We did a lot of nature journaling. I did a lot of nature journaling with the students as well. So trying to get them to think about observing. So which ones of these could we figure out by observing? And then they went out and tried to observe them and answer them. So then they began measuring, observing, discussing, digging. There was lots of conversation back and forth about how big it should be and where it should be. You can see we're right up against the portables, and that became a constant barrier. And then we had to keep coming back to that. Realistically, we're right up against the portables. On this side, we already have a concrete kind of barrier. We have a playground, so back and forth. We have full sun, so back and forth about what we should do. And then once they actually started digging, what tools do we need? How are we going to do this? The students figured out a system for how many students should be digging at a time, how many wheelbarrows are realistic, who needs to be stationed at the other end, where are we putting the dirt? They really took a leadership role in all of that. It was great. And it was especially great, something we could go outside and do. There were many days that I was just like, let's go dig. Everyone, let's stop what we're doing. Let's go dig. After they'd been digging for a while, it became time to start to see where was the water going to go? How was it working? So they did some trial runs, some accidental trial runs when we left the water on too long, but they found out that their basin overflowed. Oh no, so do we need to dig more, deeper? They ran the water and saw that it was just puddling right at the front of the basin. So they realized that they needed to angle it. We were able to activate their prior knowledge about gravity, and water runs down. And so they started angling the basin to make sure the water would actually flow all the way to the end, and figuring out how to fit the pipe in, how to support it with these rocks. I think this is a video, it'll work. Oh, sorry. So we were working the digging and the shaping at the same time as the plants. So like Stephanie mentioned in her presentation, that was one of her downsides, is she doesn't have all day with students to do this, but I do. So I could take different time in the day to work on different parts of this. So we started looking at what kind of plants. Originally, the students wanted everything. They wanted lots of trees because they wanted shade. But we kept having to go back to our actual area, and was there room for trees there? There's an emergency exit in that area, so we needed to make sure students and people would be able to walk through there. So we used various local resources, Spadefoot Nursery and a few others, Desert Survivors, and different things to look at specifically desert plants, what desert plants need, and along with what would make sense. They paid attention to the fact that it was in full sun, so every plant they looked at, they had to make sure it could be in full sun. They decided, the students noticed that a lot of the information talked about how long it took something to grow. So they started calculating that, thinking, well, if this one's not going to grow for 10 years, do we want to wait that long? And so they started to plan and pick plants that they thought would work in our basin and around our basin. they decided that we shouldn't put cacti, even though they love cacti, because too many students are walking by there. And they even looked at whether it had thorns or not. So they did a lot of investigation as to what sorts of plants we should put there. So while we're still planning the basin, building the basin, picking out the plants, I started talking to the students about how we sort of reflecting on our process and how we got to this part. And they were really excited about the fact that they're going to be growing plants, but also contributing back to groundwater. We talked about other schools might want to do the same thing. So I started talking to the students about how we did this, how we planned it. And they said, yeah, it was hard because every time we tried to look up information, everything we saw was about rainwater. We weren't using rainwater, we're using our tub, we're using greywater. So we always had to kind of modify everything that we saw and everything we read, because everything we saw was about collecting water off your roof, collecting water from your yard. So the students decided that we should document what we were doing so that if another school wants to do the same thing, they can use our resources. They don't have to only look at rainwater resources. So that started the next phase, kind of the public project. So I had them reflect. First, they thought about everything that we did, and they put that on one color sticky notes, and then everything that we had to know. And they wrote those on another sticky note. And then they put them into a timeline, trying to remember when we did which thing and when did we need each kind of knowledge, so that they could plan these presentations that they're working on now, these presentations that they hope will inform other schools that want to make basins like this. It was really great to see them reflect. It felt so authentic because this is what I did when I put this presentation together. I had to think back, what did we do? When did we do it? What pieces went where? So giving them the movable sticky notes, I mean, that's a tactic I love, because they're not stuck with an idea. They don't write it down and then it's stuck there. They can move things around, they can change. They ask for more sticky notes. And they looked at each other's plans and got different ideas and added to theirs. And from there, we came up with sort of a master list of what would need to be in their presentations about how to make a basin. So this was sort of our combined, once everyone had their ideas. They said plan over and over again. They said, we planned all the time. We kept planning. You can't just go out and start digging. You have to plan. So this was their master list of what you need to do if you want to build a water harvesting basin. And then they use that and they're working on these presentations. Several of them are doing PowerPoint presentations. One is she's making a book. She wants an actual physical book that people can look at. There are some students doing videos, mostly a combination of photographs that they're taking or that I've taken, short videos where they're explaining something, and then hand-drawn images that they're including into their presentation. So that's where we are now. They're working on their presentations. They're getting some feedback from me. Next week, they'll be paired up with another team to get feedback from the team. So the student voice and choice here, to keep a high level of rigor, everyone needs to be adhering to the steps that we identified, but they can do that in any way they want. So that's I think the student voice and choice. They can choose how they want their presentation to be, what the format is, and they got to choose whether they're working alone or with a group of 2 or 3. I try to give those choices when I can. And so that's where we are right now. They're working on their presentations. When they're done, we'll have a celebration of learning with families and people from the school. It'll be online because that's where we are right now, but they'll be presenting their presentations on how to build a basin. So my lessons learned would be, even though we didn't know exactly where this project was going to go when we started it online, learning about water, it's still to identify the important learning that you want students to end up with. That's why I like the understanding by design, the backwards design, because if I'm thinking, I want them to understand water issues. I want them to understand there's evidence for how we use water and what we should be doing with water, to kind of take the emotion out of that. If I keep that in mind, that's where I want them to end up. That's what I want them to know at the end, and identifying those important ideas about water, like that it's a finite resource, that not all the uses are equally important, that not everyone has equal access, then everything that I do, I can tie back or I can judge against that standard. Does this activity, does learning about tap water versus bottled water, is this worth doing? Does it support the learning that I want them to have? If not, I try not to do those activities. I feel like they pull away from the learning, which can be hard in elementary. There's always different fun projects and different fun activities, but I try to make sure that they align with and get us where we want it to go. Planning while allowing for flexibility, obviously anytime, but especially when you're doing a project where you don't know exactly how it's going to turn out. And listening to the students. There were several times where Stephanie and I would be discussing what we were going to do, and we would think, I don't know, what if they don't make that leap? What if they don't get to that point? How are we going to get them there? And then ended up not being the issue because they made those leaps and those jumps on their own and even beyond what I expected. So it ended up going a lot better than I thought. I was worried that they would not make the connections to building a basin when they saw the hand wash station, but they did. They were all over it. So we did not have to coax that too much. They came to it on their own, but that's it.